happening in some offices in Geneva or in some conference room is actually important for the local farmer, for a local indigenous community, or even trade unions in your country. Actually, trade unions is a bad example. You will not motivate people if you tell them why this is important for trade unions. You will motivate them if you tell them, well, this is important for the person working in their local supermarket. So here I made a mistake myself. It's really important to focus on people. Then what's important is also to offer opportunities for action. Once you manage to tell the story, to kind of get a sense of revolt or motivation, engagement from your audience, you need not to lose them, not to leave them frustrated, but give them an opportunity to do something. We come back at the real end of the presentation, but basically those actions can be both online action, ask them at least to retweet, to share the webcast link, to tell their friends about it, and it can be also more concrete real world action. But if you don't do that, often if you have a negative message, for instance, you say that the UN now is looking at how the rights of indigenous communities in your country are being affected, and you don't give them any opportunity to react to that, you might just leave them frustrated, angry, but with a sense of non-fulfillment. So it's important to always try to convert this energy that you're creating into something that they can do positively. And then think about which communities and organizations you want to target. Your volunteers, you have a Facebook page for your organization. That's fair enough, that's a starting point. But then also try to see how you can use the UPR. I mean, this happens, every 4th year? It's not something that happens very often for your individual country. So think about perhaps how this could be a hook to get other organizations that are not necessarily interested in the human rights policies, but to suddenly pay attention to what is happening there. To do that, particularly it's important to think about the themes that will be discussed. So for instance, to come back to a trade union example, the trade unions might not be paying much attention to the UPR, but if there is something about workers' rights being discussed at the UPR, for instance, you might really think about how your human rights organization can certainly try to speak and to use social media to reach out to people that are interested more in trade unions, in workers' struggles. Social media is particularly powerful in doing this because you can ask them to share your content, or you can use their own social media platforms in a way that an organization might not be willing to join your campaign because this is too abstract for them. But if the theme resonates with them, they will be very interested in sharing their social media opportunities or tools for you to speak to their communities. Now, journalists, the media in general. What's very important with journalists is to build a relationship. You can put your social media content, for instance, just some tweets about what is happening, and then you might be lucky that the journalist just read it and is interested. But if you don't have a relation, your impact on the journalist is very limited. I found, from my personal experience, being a climate advocate or activist, I found this being very useful. Now I have journalists very often sending me messages, reacting to my tweets and saying, I don't understand what is happening. And so I spend a lot of time trying to translate for them what is happening there in the UN, because I understand the UN, and to some extent after this training you understand the UPR, but the journalists in your country have no idea about this. So you have to try to translate that for them. I spend, and I lose a lot of time when I'm at the UN trying to translate and help journalists, but the great thing is that while I try to remain credible and neutral when I talk to journalists, at least when they approach me as a source of information, I can always frame it differently. So I can give you a very concrete example that touches on human rights. Before, there is a week ongoing of negotiation in Bonn about climate policies. I was one of the only person active on social media who went there. I just came back yesterday from Germany. And so I had a few journalists from US, India, from Europe asking me what was happening there because they couldn't afford the ticket to come. I could have spoken only about the nitty-gritty details of the negotiation, but one of the great things that happened and that almost nobody paid attention to was that UN independent experts on human rights had sent, before the beginning of this negotiation, a letter highlighting to climate negotiators how important the interplay between human rights and climate change was. And so without trying to oversell this letter to the journalist, anytime someone was asking me to make a summary of what happened this week, I will always start using this letter as the kind of opening. And in a few other stories, they picked up this to reframe a little bit. So I didn't push it hard, I didn't do like advocacy on it, I didn't send my tweets directly to them, but whenever they will come to me, I will have an opportunity to frame a little bit their stories. And so this can be a very important and powerful tool for you if you use social media. The way you build a relationship with journalists, I try to identify here 3 key elements. The first one is, of course, to let them know that you are there, that you have expertise, you have understanding, and you have materials that might be helpful for them. Journalists are always craving for stories. You just need to let them know that you are a person they want to hear from. To do that, you need to be proactive. Check which outlets might be potentially an interesting channel for stories about the UPR, but also check which individual journalist. Really try to look at the name of the journalists themselves. A lot of them are on social media. Tweet directly to them. I will come back to the timing of the work. But for instance, 2 months before the UPR starts, start to tweet from time to time to a journalist, just so that they know you exist and you're relevant to them. Start to share, hey, have you seen this article? Maybe it's interesting for you. About other things that are not necessarily related to the UPR. But then we will start to see that you have added value and they need to pay attention to you. Whether they trust you or not is a different thing, but at least we start to see you. In the social media world, we are totally lost in a wave, in an ocean of different Twitter icons, Facebook, LinkedIn, and so on. So you just need to make sure that people see you in the middle of this soup. The second thing is to build trust and establish yourself as a source. There it's important to try to be careful when you share information that the journalist can really trust you. I mean, that's a classical recommendation, so I don't go much more into this. The final one is for journalists get a lot of people trying to sell them stories. The difference you can make is when you really make it clear to them that your relationship to them is a win-win relation. They win something, it's not just you trying to sell them something. You win things when you take time to respond to questions. I spend a lot of time answering questions about how the carbon markets work. It's something I have absolutely no interest in. But then the journalists know that actually I'm not always responding to them when I want to frame a story. I'm also there just to help them get their stories. And then they respect me in a way that they might not interact with other NGOs, where systematically the NGO will respond when they can send their message, but otherwise not. Something that's very important on social media compared to the real world is that social media, on social media, ego, personal ambition and so on is a lot more accepted than, and lots more open than in the real world. If a journalist writes a story and you answer it on social media and say, this was a great article by the name of a journalist, and then you share it, you will just flatter them and make them feel good about the stories they're writing. You don't have to do that if you don't believe it, but if you want to share the story, it makes a difference if you make a direct comment about the skills of a journalist, or you just try to work a little bit with the ego, and that really works. You don't have to go, against your principle or against if that's not what you feel, but if it's what you feel, just spend the 30 seconds necessary to really highlight the role of that journalist. They appreciate that a lot, and that's something that's it's kind of accepted on social media to do more of this. And finally, in relation to journalists, always make sure that you don't only try to frame their narrative, but whenever they put out a story that has your narrative, use their content as much as possible. So sharing your own press advisory is something, but if you have a news story that says a little bit of the same, that's a lot stronger to some of the audiences that you might use. So really make sure that if you start to sell stories or to provide information to journalists, make sure to monitor what they write afterwards. So that if they do include your references, for instance in my case, a couple of them spoke about human rights in the climate negotiation, then as soon as they do that, share it on your mailing list, their stories and so on, and highlight. But it's not just saying it, but the media is also saying it. Finally, decision makers. I won't go much into this because it relates a lot more to advocacy, perhaps just to social media. One thing that's important to think about is how when you try to influence decision makers or civil servants, other actors can play in the picture as well to help you do that. So for instance, using your activist maybe to try to get your activists just before the UPR to tweet directly or to send messages on Facebook or to one other person you identified. In the government, you often have a difference between the public figures. So, for instance, it really depends on countries. And we will come back to this. Social media is very different depending on the country. But in some countries, for instance, almost all ministers and all members of the parliament are on Twitter, are on Facebook with public profiles, public pages. So those you can really try to get and to communicate with in the beginning. Often, actually, like I guess in the US, they all have a team of 20 people managing a Twitter account, so it's difficult to get at the person. But in most other places, and for instance, I can tell you my experience with Poland. Poland is a very important country for climate policy in Europe because they are against any climate policy in Europe. Basically, they are very against climate policy. They are not very professional in using social media, but their decision makers all like it because of the ego person. He can tweet to their ministers, and he is going to respond, the minister himself. When he responds on Twitter, Twitter is open, it's not like Facebook when you get communication that only people who are already friends can see. Everyone else can see it. And a couple of times, by tweeting something a little bit, like pushing him a little bit, the Minister of Climate Change of Poland reacted a little bit quick to my tweet, and then a lot of NGOs saw that and started to build a relationship to shame him for his response and so on. This is interesting because they behave on social media, sometimes decision makers. It might be a minister or member of your local parliament in a way they would not do in public, but because they don't necessarily always understand the consequences, sometimes they expose themselves. So you can try to use that a little bit to get a discussion that is more sincere or more open than you will have otherwise. Right. Now, looking at different, this is very much too small, but I can try to explain what it is. Looking at different social media platforms and the reality around the world. First, here is a list of 10 typical social media. It's just to keep in mind how many users there are. So the first line is about 1 billion users of Facebook. I think it's in 2013, so now it's 7 more. The second one is YouTube, the third one is Twitter, the fourth one is Google+, and the fifth one is LinkedIn. When we speak about social media, very often we only focus on Facebook, sometimes Twitter, but it's important to remember all these different palette of options. Some of them, like, I don't even know all of them. There is Reddit, there is Pinterest. All of them have different pros and cons. You don't need to use the 10 of them. I've never used half of them at least. But it's important to remember that YouTube is there, for instance, and that's also one of the social media. It's not just Facebook.